We all carry stories about love, about connection, about what it means to belong. And sometimes the stories we carry aren't ones we wrote. They were written for us, shaped by experiences we had no control over. Now, I want you to imagine someone who moves through life like an island, strong, independent, untouched. They seem unbothered, self-sufficient, even distant. And we tell ourselves a story about them. They don't care. They don't feel. They just walk away. But what if I told you that's not the truth? What if the person who seems the most untouchable is actually protecting something incredibly fragile? See, when we talk about attachment, about connection, we have to talk about vulnerability. And here's the thing, vulnerability is terrifying when you've been taught, directly or indirectly, that closeness comes at a cost, that love is conditional, that needing others is dangerous. So what happens? Walls go up, distance is created, because when connection has felt unsafe, the safest thing you can do is convince yourself you don't need it. It's not about not caring, it's about self-protection. It's about a childhood where emotions weren't safe to express. It's about relationships where independence was mistaken for strength and needing others was seen as weakness. It's about a nervous system wired to believe that love means risk. So, yes, sometimes they walk away. Not because they don't feel, but because feeling too much has never felt safe. Not because they don't want love, but because love has felt like something to survive rather than something to embrace. We all carry stories about love and connection, stories that shape the way we move through the world, the way we let people in, and the way we protect ourselves. But here's the thing, some of those stories, they weren't written by us. They were handed to us sometimes so early in life that we don't even realize we're living by them. They were shaped by the way we were cared for, the way our emotions were received, the way our needs were met or not met. For some, love was something that felt warm, steady, and safe. For others, love was inconsistent, conditional, or even painful. And when you grow up with love that feels risky, your nervous system takes note. You learn to adjust, to adapt, to survive. You learn that needing too much pushes people away. That vulnerability comes at a cost, that the safest place to be is on your own. And before you know it, you're carrying a story that says, I don't need anyone. But that story, it's not the truth. It's a defense, one built out of necessity, not choice. When we talk about people who seem emotionally distant, people who don't express their needs, people who walk away when relationships start to demand too much, there's a tendency to label them. We call them cold, detached, uncaring. But that's a misunderstanding, because beneath that outward self-sufficiency is something far more complex. It's not that they don't care, it's that caring too much has never felt safe. So they move through life like an island, keeping their emotions private, staying in control, never letting themselves rely too much on anyone. This way of being isn't random, it's learned, and it's often learned early. Imagine a child reaching out for comfort, for reassurance, for connection. And instead of being met with warmth, they're met with something else, maybe a parent who is emotionally unavailable, who dismisses their feelings, who tells them directly or indirectly that big emotions aren't welcome. Maybe the parent is overwhelmed, too busy, or simply doesn't know how to respond. Maybe the child's needs are met in a physical sense, food, shelter, structure, but emotionally, there's a gap. What does that child do? They adapt. They learn that showing emotion doesn't lead to connection, it leads to discomfort. They learn that asking for help won't bring support, it will bring rejection or even shame. And so they start shutting it down. Bit by bit, they disconnect from their own emotional world because feeling too much is dangerous when there's no one there to hold space for it. Over time, this becomes second nature. They stop looking for comfort. They stop expecting deep emotional attunement. And they start believing that self-sufficiency is the only way to stay safe. By the time they grow up, this strategy is so ingrained that they don't even recognize it as a strategy. It just feels like who they are. They see themselves as independent, logical, and capable. They don't get overly emotional in relationships. They don't get attached easily. They don't rely on others. And on the surface, that might look like strength. It might even look like confidence. But beneath it, there's a deep reluctance to be vulnerable, to trust that someone will truly be there, to believe that connection won't come with a cost. So when people say they just don't care, they're missing the real story. The truth is, the dismissive avoidant cares a lot, but their nervous system has spent a lifetime learning to suppress, to minimize, to disconnect from that care. Because when emotional closeness has felt overwhelming, the only way to cope is to stay at a distance. And that's not a conscious choice, it's not calculated. It's wired in. Their walls aren't about shutting others out for the sake of it. Their walls exist because, at some point, those walls were necessary for survival. Avoidance isn't about not caring, it's about self-protection. It's easy to assume that someone who withdraws, who keeps their emotions in check, who seems unaffected by closeness or distance, simply doesn't care as deeply as others do. But that assumption is rooted in a misunderstanding of what avoidance actually is. Because the truth is, people who seem emotionally detached often feel just as much as anyone else, sometimes even more. The difference is that they've learned to bury those feelings, to suppress them, to keep them at a safe distance. And that's not because they don't want connection. It's because connection has, at some point, felt unsafe. For many, emotions have always been a source of connection. They've been met with warmth, with validation, with an invitation to express, to share, to be held in their vulnerability. But for those who have developed an avoidant attachment, emotions have often been something to manage alone. They've been met with dismissal, with discomfort, with the subtle or not so subtle message that needing others is a weakness. So they've learned to cope by shutting down their emotional world, by turning inward, by becoming self-reliant to an extreme degree. They've learned that needing less is safer than needing more. But that suppression doesn't mean the emotions aren't there. It just means they've become skilled at ignoring them, at numbing them, at convincing themselves that they don't matter. And over time, this becomes automatic. It's not a conscious decision to withhold affection or to avoid intimacy. It's a deeply ingrained survival strategy. It's the body and mind working together to create distance before distance can create pain. Emotional suppression often starts in childhood, shaping adult relationships in ways that can be hard to recognize at first. Imagine a child who reaches for a parent's hand when they're scared, only to be told to toughen up. Imagine a child who expresses sadness only to be met with discomfort or irritation. Imagine a child who learns that their needs will either be ignored or treated as an inconvenience. What does that child do? They stop reaching. They stop expressing. They stop believing that emotions are meant to be shared at all. And instead, they start handling everything on their own. At first, this looks like independence. The child learns to soothe themselves, to regulate their emotions without the help of others, to become the kind of person who doesn't need reassurance or support. But what starts as a necessary adaptation in childhood doesn't just disappear in adulthood. It carries over, shaping the way they navigate relationships, the way they respond to closeness, the way they handle conflict, love, and connection. By the time they reach adulthood, this way of coping is so deeply embedded that they don't even realize they're doing it. It just feels like who they are. But the truth is, this isn't who they are. It's who they became in order to survive a world where emotional needs weren't fully met. It's who they had to be when vulnerability felt more like a risk than a refuge. And so they grow into adults who move through relationships with an invisible barrier between themselves and others. One that says, I will be close, but not too close. I will love, but not in a way that makes me dependent. I will connect, but only to a point. Love has felt more like something to survive than something to embrace. Because when emotional closeness has been overwhelming, the body learns to associate love with something that requires caution, something that can be taken away, something that if relied upon too much can lead to pain. And so love becomes something to manage rather than something to fully experience. It becomes something that is carefully controlled, rationed, kept at a safe distance. When relationships start to demand more emotional depth, more openness, more vulnerability, this survival mechanism kicks in. They might pull away. They might downplay their feelings. They might convince themselves that they don't need the relationship as much as the other person does. And the people around them, partners, friends, even family, often take this as a sign of disinterest. But what's actually happening beneath the surface is far more complex. Their system is trying to protect them from the very thing they crave. They might deeply want connection, but their body has learned that connection is unpredictable, that it comes with expectations they're not sure they can meet, that it requires a level of emotional exposure that feels unsafe. So rather than risk being overwhelmed by emotions they don't know how to process, they choose distance, not because they want to hurt others, but because staying detached feels like the safest option. Walking away isn't about a lack of feelings, it's about being overwhelmed by them. On the surface, it might seem like someone with an avoidant attachment style simply doesn't get as emotionally invested as others do. They appear calm, logical, and unaffected by the intensity of relationships. When things become too complicated, too emotional, or too intimate, they seem to walk away with ease, as if none of it really mattered. But what's really happening beneath that exterior is something entirely different. It's not that they don't feel, it's that they feel too much. And when emotions become too intense, when vulnerability starts to creep in, when closeness threatens the self-sufficiency they've worked so hard to maintain, their nervous system goes into overdrive. To understand this, we have to recognize that emotional regulation isn't the same for everyone. Some people experience emotions in a way that feels manageable, natural, even welcome. But for the avoidant, emotions, especially those tied to relationships, can feel like something to control, suppress, or avoid altogether. It's not because they don't want connection. It's because connection, at a deep level, represents something overwhelming, something that threatens their sense of control, something that feels unpredictable. And when emotions feel like they could spiral beyond what they can handle, the safest option seems to be shutting them down. That's why when conflict arises, when emotional demands increase, when a relationship starts requiring them to be fully open, they withdraw. Sometimes they physically leave, creating space and distance to regain a sense of control. Other times, they emotionally check out while still being present, numbing themselves to the intensity of the moment. And to those on the receiving end, this can feel like rejection, like abandonment, like proof that they never really cared. But in reality, it's a survival response. They're not leaving because they don't care. They're leaving because they don't know how to process the depth of what they're feeling. We mistake their detachment for coldness, but it's fear disguised as control. When someone has spent their entire life learning to suppress emotions, staying detached becomes second nature. It's not about a lack of love, it's about self-protection. The avoidant has developed a strategy to keep themselves from feeling too deeply, because they've learned that deep emotions come with risk. Maybe they grew up in an environment where expressing feelings led to disappointment or shame. Maybe they learned early on that the people they depended on weren't truly reliable. Maybe they've been hurt in ways that made them believe the only way to avoid pain is to avoid attachment altogether. So they create distance, not because they don't want love, but because love feels like something that has to be carefully controlled. They don't want to be put in a position where they need someone too much. They don't want to risk losing themselves in emotions they don't know how to manage. And most of all, they don't want to feel vulnerable in a way that leaves them exposed to the possibility of abandonment or disappointment. It's not about being indifferent, it's about being afraid of what might happen if they let their guard down completely. But here's the thing, no one is truly emotionless. No one is immune to love, to connection, to the fundamental human need to belong. The dismissive avoidant might seem like they don't need anyone. But that's only because they've been conditioned to believe that needing others is a weakness. Deep down, they crave connection just like everyone else. They just don't know how to express it in a way that feels safe. And that's why their behavior can be so confusing. They might pull away even when they care deeply. They might seem uninterested even when they desperately want closeness. They might act indifferent even when their heart is breaking. Every defense mechanism is a survival strategy rooted in deep wounds. The walls they've built weren't constructed out of malice or indifference. They were built out of necessity, out of a need to protect themselves from the kind of emotional vulnerability that once felt unbearable. When someone has spent years, sometimes decades, learning to cope by avoiding deep emotional connections, breaking that pattern isn't easy. It requires unlearning beliefs that have shaped their entire sense of self. It requires challenging fears that have long dictated their behavior. It requires opening up to the possibility that love doesn't have to be something to fear. And that kind of transformation doesn't happen overnight. It takes awareness, it takes willingness. It takes the slow and sometimes painful process of learning that emotions don't have to be overwhelming, that connection doesn't have to mean losing control, that love doesn't have to be a threat. For some, this realization never fully comes. They continue to move through life believing that staying detached is the best way to stay safe. But for others, there comes a moment, a relationship, a loss, a breakthrough that makes them question everything. A moment where they realize that avoiding love hasn't actually spared them from pain. It's only kept them from experiencing the depth of connection they secretly long for. Because in the end, no matter how strong the walls, no matter how deeply ingrained the defenses, the human heart still wants what it wants. It still longs to be seen, to be understood, to be loved not for the mask it wears, but for what lies beneath it. And when someone with an avoidant attachment finally allows themselves to be vulnerable, when they take even the smallest step toward connection instead of away from it, it's not weakness, it's courage. If they were honest, they'd say, "It cares so much, I don't know what to do with it." The world looks at them and assumes they are indifferent, detached, maybe even cold. People say they don't feel, that they move on too easily, that they don't invest in relationships the way others do. And yet, if you could step inside their mind, if you could sit with them in the quiet spaces where no one else can see, you'd find something completely different. You'd find someone who cares deeply, so deeply that it terrifies them. Someone who has spent a lifetime learning how to hide their emotions, not because they don't have them, but because those emotions have always felt too overwhelming to handle. Caring isn't the problem. The problem is that caring has never felt safe. Imagine growing up in an environment where expressing emotions was met with discomfort, disinterest, or even punishment. Imagine learning over and over again that needing too much, feeling too much, or depending on someone too much would only lead to rejection or disappointment. When that's the lesson that gets reinforced, it doesn't take long to internalize the belief that emotions are dangerous, that they make you vulnerable, that they can be used against you. So instead of embracing them, you start to suppress them. You start to detach. You start to convince yourself that you don't actually need what you so desperately crave. That's how the pattern begins. At first, it's a defense mechanism, a way to cope with a world that hasn't felt emotionally safe. But over time, it becomes a way of being. The habit of shutting down emotions becomes second nature, so much so that even they don't always recognize what's happening. When they pull away, when they avoid intimacy, when they dismiss their own needs, they're not doing it to hurt anyone. They're doing it because in their mind, that's the only way to stay in control. And control to them has always meant safety. But beneath that controlled exterior, beneath the carefully maintained walls, there is a storm of feelings they don't know how to express. It's not that they don't feel love, it's that love feels too big, too consuming, too unpredictable. It's not that they don't experience longing, it's that longing makes them feel exposed. It's not that they don't get hurt, it's that showing pain has never felt like an option. So they act as if they don't care. They minimize, they rationalize, they intellectualize. They do everything except allow themselves to simply feel, because feeling is the one thing that has always seemed too risky. But even as they suppress, even as they push people away, even as they insist that they are fine on their own, there is always a part of them that knows the truth. There are moments, fleeting but real, where the weight of what they're avoiding catches up to them. Maybe it's a quiet night alone when the distractions fade and the loneliness creeps in. Maybe it's seeing someone else express love freely and realizing how foreign that feels. Maybe it's losing someone before they ever let themselves fully show up. In those moments, there is a quiet awareness. I do care. I've always cared. I just don't know how to let myself show it. And the hardest part, the world doesn't make it easy for them to change. People misunderstand them. They get labeled as unfeeling, as heartless, as incapable of love. When they struggle to open up, they are met with frustration rather than patience. When they need space to process emotions they don't fully understand, they are accused of not being invested. When they finally try tentatively, hesitantly to be vulnerable, they often find that others expect them to move faster, to change overnight, to suddenly become emotionally fluent in a language they've spent their whole lives avoiding. And when they inevitably struggle, when they pull back out of habit, when they falter in their attempts at connection, it only reinforces their deepest fear. Maybe I really am incapable of love. Maybe it's safer not to try. But the truth is, they are not incapable of love. They are not cold. They are not indifferent. They are not unreachable. They are simply carrying wounds that have taught them to be afraid. And like anyone else, they can heal. But healing doesn't happen through shame. It doesn't happen through ultimatums. It doesn't happen through being told over and over again that they don't care enough. It happens through safety, through patience, through the slow and sometimes painful process of unlearning the belief that vulnerability is something to fear. For some, that healing never happens. They remain locked in their patterns, believing that distance is the only way to stay safe. They convince themselves that they don't need deep connection, that relationships are too complicated, that emotional closeness isn't worth the risk. But for others, there comes a moment, a relationship, a realization, a loss that forces them to question everything. A moment where they see, maybe for the first time, that the very thing they've been avoiding is the thing they've needed all along. And that's when the real work begins, because breaking free from avoidance isn't just about deciding to be different. It's about facing emotions they've spent a lifetime suppressing. It's about sitting with discomfort instead of running from it. It's about allowing themselves to care openly even when it feels terrifying. It's about learning slowly but surely that love doesn't have to mean losing control. Not everyone will understand this journey, Not everyone will have the patience to walk alongside them as they learn to open up. And not everyone will be able to see past the walls to the person inside who has always cared more than they've ever let on. But for those who do, for those who can look past the detachment, past the withdrawal, past the carefully maintained armor, there is something beautiful waiting underneath. Because when they finally let themselves love, when they finally allow themselves to be fully seen, it's not shallow, it's not indifferent, it's not half-hearted. It is deep and real and overwhelming in the best possible way. And maybe one day, when they've done the work, when they've learned to trust, when they've allowed themselves to step fully into connection without fear, they'll be able to say the words they've never dared to speak. I have always cared. I just didn't know how to show it, you said. All these things is for my Yit video, so give me the description, hashtags, tags, and high-ranked key.